for a lot of people, particularly some of the international investors, starting to look at different options, whether that was Canberra or Wellington or Washington DC. I think they sort of got some confidence that if there was going to be another, whether it's a global pandemic or some sort of a crisis, that those government cities do quite well. If, for example, at my house that I live in with my family, if the government was to not allow me to renew my lease or didn't renew my lease, I think you would see no one would ever buy property in Canberra again.
So that's good. You've had Washington and you've had Canberra, so you've got all the capitals.
Yeah.
How do they differ? Like, what's the?
Lot of similarities.
Yeah.
And I often have talked about particularly after COVID, what happens with property in capital city markets, and sort of looked at a bit of data around, Canberra, Wellington, Washington DC, and what happened to property in that area, and because it was interesting to see, with vacancy rates, particularly Melbourne, but probably got hit the worst in Australia.
Yeah.
Canberra's vacancy went down, so did Wellington, so did DC. A lot of these capital cities that, when there's a big global crisis, the property generally performs well. So that was interesting to look at that data.
It'd be good to talk about the similarities. I'm Michael Carboni. You can call me Carbs, and we're here on Property Now once again this week. And every month or so we try and go around Australia and look at one of the main capital cities and get a bit of a property market update. Today we're talking Canberra, we're talking ACT, and I've got with me Simon Chester, Sales and Strategic Partnerships Director at Geocon. So welcome, Simon, mate. Good to have you here. Geocon, for anyone that doesn't know the Canberra ACT market, I would say probably the player when it comes to building and construction and development down in the ACT. You guys only develop in the ACT, and there's some reasons for that. So I'm really keen to unpack the data, what's happening in the ACT, what the future might look like down there as well. So I think you're the perfect man for the job. So welcome, man.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm really intrigued here. So we're comparing Canberra to Washington to Wellington so what are so are there any more similarities? Is it literally the same things happened in each of these cities after COVID? Like, what else can you unpack there?
Yeah, so we looked at the data for a few different capital cities because often with these capital cities, they're not they're not the first guess in trivia competitions with what's the capital city. I mean, the amount of times I've gone overseas and people are yelling at me saying Sydney's the capital of Australia and or Melbourne, but they don't often think Canberra, and it's the same, I guess, with New Zealand. A lot of people think it's Auckland. Yeah, but the capital cities are set up for a reason, and it was really interesting after COVID to look at some of the key key metrics around property and vacancy rates, unemployment. So during COVID, a lot of these government cities and capital cities had to expand their workforce. I mean, here in Australia, we had JobKeeper and JobSeeker, which were two massive initiatives that the federal government rolled out that were all getting administered from Canberra. So whilst the unemployment rates in Melbourne and Sydney went quite high, they came down in Canberra, and then that obviously leads to vacancy rates coming down and rents going up. So yeah, it was interesting, and so we had a bit of a look just out of curiosity more than anything, and saw similarities in other capital cities around the world where that was happening. So I think for a lot of people, particularly some of the international investors and people that traditionally had a lot of investment properties in Melbourne or Sydney, starting to look at different options, whether that was Canberra or Wellington or Washington DC. I think they sort of got some confidence that if there was going to be another, whether it's a global pandemic or some sort of a crisis, that those government cities do quite well.
I never really thought of that from an international perspective, like an international investment perspective, that you might have people out of, say, China, Hong Kong, that would be looking at international markets. They'd be comparing between your Canberras and your Wellingtons and your DCs and that sort of thing as well. That's actually quite interesting.
Yeah.
So COVID was obviously, in terms of property prices, like things boomed in Canberra in particular. We saw it happen across Australia in a lot of areas. What sort of trends are we seeing right now? So COVID in the rear vision mirror, things starting to sort of settle a little bit. We're back to normal, I would suggest, in a lot of ways. What sort of trends are you seeing down in Canberra, in the ACT, in the capital?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really challenging market at the moment. I think for not just us in Canberra, but a lot of other developers that we're speaking to, it's tough out there. The cost to deliver projects is a lot higher than it was pre-COVID, and even sort of during COVID for stuff that had already started. So the cost to deliver a project is a barrier, obviously, for people, because that's just onto the baseline price. So, we were being able to deliver our last city project and selling that at about that 8,000 a metre, and now it's sort of that 10.5, 11, but there's less profit in it than there was at the 8. So it's significantly harder at the moment, and particularly when you're looking at attracting investors. Whilst our biggest investor market is Sydney, and we get a lot of buyers from Sydney, and our prices are significantly cheaper, it's still a large whack of money to invest in a property, particularly if you haven't had that wage growth, and you're on a similar salary that you were, maybe with a few CPI increases over those years. It's challenging. So we're finding it, we're having to work a lot harder for each of the sales, and people are taking a lot longer to commit than they were, say, 2, 3, 4 years ago. So we are still getting a good rate of sales come through each month, but a lot of the feedback we're getting from our selling agents is it's someone that they met sort of 6 to 9 months ago, and it's not those 6 to 9 days that we were seeing during the period a few years ago, where it was a lot of FOMO in terms of investing and missing out on a property.
So do you think that investors in particular, they're looking at the market now saying, look, things aren't moving as quickly as they were, we've got time to think about it? Is that basically what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I still think there's, for investors in particular, there's a lot of uncertainty, and they're not quite sure what's happening with interest rates. You one day they're saying, there could be a cut in December, there could be a cut in January, and that's great that if people are saying that there could be a cut coming, but then the next day it's, there might be one more increase because the inflation data wasn't quite. So, there is that uncertainty out there for people. I do think, though, that, we've seen this many times before, that it won't take much at all. One rate cut, I think, will really significantly have a difference in the market, because, as I said, the margins in the projects now are, tighter than ever. So the prices are still, extremely affordable and good prices, and it won't take much for it to really. I think a lot of people are really trying to sell for the absolute cheapest possible now to get that sales traction, and it won't take much for those prices to go right back up again. So the people that are buying now, I think, are getting really good buys, but I completely understand that it is a really uncertain landscape at the moment around interest rates and what's going to be happening.
Yeah, definitely. And when you're seeing the types of buyers, so you've already mentioned investors versus, like, say, your own occupiers, what's sort of the breakup of that typically? Is it more investors in Canberra these days, or is it?
Yeah, it really depends on the project. So, as you mentioned, we are the largest builder developer in Canberra. So we've delivered 25, 30 projects in all regions of Canberra in those town centres. When we're building something in the city, like our current project, we do see more of the owner occupiers, just because the price point is it's the sort of highest square metre rate of all of the areas. When you go to those outer areas of Canberra, the sort of the further you get out of the CBD, which isn't far in comparison to Sydney and Melbourne, you do tend to see a higher percentage of investors. Still never more than sort of 50-55%, but when we're looking at the city, it's more like sort of 30% investors, and the rest owner occupiers, just because of the sort of demographic of people downsizing from the suburbs and into the city. And then your price point in the CBD of Canberra, you could probably get something, for a similar square metre rate, maybe sort of 30 k's out of Sydney. So, I still think people like to, buy close to where they live, and that's the price point of Canberra that generally attracts people out of Sydney.
Yeah, I love that. From an investment perspective, what keeps investors so hungry in Canberra and in the ACT? What are some of the
Yeah, so
And
there's a few different things that that attract investors and keeps them hungry. Obviously, I mentioned price point. We do have our prices are significantly cheaper than Sydney, and our proximity to Sydney is means it's our biggest investor market outside of Canberra. From an international point of view, we've now seeing some our international purchasers purchase their third and fourth properties through us, and that was a market 4 or 5 years ago that didn't really exist for us. One of the main attractions for foreign investors into Canberra is the tax incentives. So
tell us, unpack that a little bit.
So there's no foreign stamp duty surcharge in Canberra.
So if foreigners are investing anywhere else in Australia, they're paying a tax, but in Canberra they're not.
Correct.
Okay.
So just to expand on that. So if I'm a foreign investor purchasing in Canberra, I'm paying stamp duty, but I'm paying the same as what anyone in Australia or a local would do. So to put it into perspective, if you're buying a $600,000 property in Canberra as opposed to Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, you're about $70,000 better off because you're not having to pay the surcharge on top of the stamp duty. If the higher the purchase price, the more tax you're paying. If you get to $700,000, it's about $100,000 in tax incentives. So that's a big one. On top of that, because Canberra's classed as a regional sector, you're getting 5 points towards your permanent residency. So if you're looking to save money on tax, it's a good one. But if you're looking to migrate to Australia, you're getting a leg up with 5 points towards your permanent residency, which is a big, those 5 points could mean the difference between getting your permanent residency and not. And so that's not something you're going to get in Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane. So those two factors have meant that we are starting to see a market that wasn't open to us 5 years ago. We're now starting to see purchases, into there. We've had one person buy in each of our last 5 projects from overseas, just purely based on the tax savings.
I would think as well from an investor perspective, like if you look at Canberra, the first thing that comes to mind from me is there's the types of industries that are down there. I mean, you've obviously got government is down there in a big way. You've got a lot of medical industries down there as well. But the government in particular is like you'd find a lot of maybe short-term stays, like people that are going to be there for 2, 3, 4 years. So are they necessarily going to buy? Maybe, maybe not. So maybe this means you've got some people with good incomes that are going to be renting down there. So from an investor perspective, from a yield perspective, I don't know if you've got any numbers or data around the kind of rental prices down there at the moment, what the yields look like at the moment.
Yeah.
But what can you tell us from that perspective?
Yeah, and you're spot on in terms of the sort of demographic. It's a very transient market.
Yep.
So every year in Canberra, give or take, you've got about 30,000 people coming to Canberra and 20,000 leaving. So you're getting a net sort of 10,000 increase in population each year. So, but of those 30,000, they're coming from a variety of reasons. Government is a big one, whether they've just finished university and they've been accepted into the APS graduate program where they work around the different departments. They might be going there to study at one of the military academies before they join the Army, Navy or Air Force. That's all done in Canberra. They might be coming to study because the university sector is very big with 5 universities. So they're coming, the 30,000 coming, 20,000 going, and so it does have a big impact on the rents, and you're sort of getting anywhere sort of between 5 and 7% returns in Canberra, and that's been pretty stable for a while now. 5, 6, 7 years ago, the property investor story in Canberra was very much yield based. It was all about the yields you were going to get in Canberra, and the growth was quite stagnant. But we've actually seen, the growth, particularly in the unit space, pick up considerably in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's now, a bit more exciting to be talking about the capital growth as opposed to just the strong yields that we have had for quite some time. But you're right, it's got the highest disposable income of anywhere in Australia off the back of the government sectors down there, and so that leads to higher rents, and which for investors is great.
And you already spoke about growth, so there's obviously been some growth since COVID. The growth has been phenomenal. Do you foresee, and it's hard to predict, so I'm not going to ask you to make any cement any predictions in, but how do you feel it could move into the future? I mean, Canberra ACT is probably becoming one of the most expensive cities now, right? It's catching up. It's not going to catch up to Sydney, but it's certainly, I think, maybe overtaken the Melbournes.
Yeah, for the established houses.
Yeah,
Yep.
for established houses.
Yep.
So let's talk about established versus apartments and all that sort of thing. Like where are we sitting in terms of other markets as well? What makes Canberra so attractive in your opinion?
Well, so still quite a big gap between houses and units. So that's why I'm still quite positive that there's going to be quite a bit more growth in both markets. But I just think that gap eventually will get closer between houses and units. I mean, we look at when we're doing a development, what's the median house price in the sort of 5 closest suburbs, and more often than not, it's it's double. We're looking at our city project now. You can't get in for under 2.5 million in the closest suburbs to buy an established home, where we're building apartments from sort of 550, so 4 times the amount. Now the size is obviously a big difference, so that's where I do see when that gap gets closer, there'll be some growth, because I don't see the houses. The growth might slow up a little bit, but it's not going to go backwards to close the gap. It'll be sort of a bit slower growth, I think, in the housing market, but continuous growth, and then that gap will just naturally get a little bit smaller, because there is a really large gap at the moment between the median house and the median unit price, particularly in those sort of city areas and other town centre areas. So yeah, look, the houses, particularly in COVID, were the growth was astronomical. But again, Canberra is very different from Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. I flew in this morning, and looking out the window of the plane, you're seeing these new developments that are maybe an hour drive out of Sydney. And each time I come up, it's sort of getting further and further out. Whereas Canberra's an island with no more land. It's locked by the New South Wales border, and twice in the last decade, the ACT government has extended the border by buying some additional land off New South Wales. So it's a really supply and demand issue there, where to get a block of land, you've got to go in a lottery system, and when they can find some land to build houses on. So that's really led to some explosive growth in the housing market, because it's very hard to get a brand new house and land package.
I've heard you talk about Canberra or the ACT as an island before, and obviously there's no water surrounding it, but it is that border, right? Yeah. So if you want to be in the ACT, if you want to be in Canberra, they're not making more land, or maybe they are. They're buying land off New South Wales. I didn't know about that. That's interesting.
Small amounts, and it's hard to do. And it's really the way they've done it is it's to sort of get a bit of area in a development that's right on the fringe of the border. But yeah, it is. It's an island. Canberra and Singapore are essentially the same size in terms of land mass. The only difference is that Singapore's got the ocean around it. We've got New South Wales. So you can see what's happening to property prices in island nations like Singapore and Hong Kong.
When there's scarcity in that land value, like that typically means things continue to grow, right?
Correct.
Amazing. And I see it's really interesting. So when I look at like a lot of the house and land developments around there, they're sort of outside of the ACT. Like I see a lot in Goulburn, for example.
Yep.
Whereas in Canberra itself, there's a lot of apartments, a lot more. When I drive, and again, you mentioned flying into Sydney and you see all these developments happening an hour away from Sydney. I'm always interested driving into Canberra, seeing how many apartments there actually are close by, because I always think, it's regional, so there's more land, but there really isn't, as you're saying. It's
no,
so.
And when I come back to the population growth, that net 10,000 each year, when there's not the ability to for them necessarily to get a brand new house and land package or move into one of the new developments, because they just don't exist. It's all about that urban infill, and that's where the apartment space has really thrived in the last sort of 15 or so years, to be able to it's just filled a need in the market to be able to house the growth. And the AST government last year reforecast their figures. It was expected that we would be hitting the 800,000 mark by sort of 2080. That's been now reforecast to 2060. So the growth is exceeding what the previous forecasts were. So it's going to need a lot more creativity and a lot more land to be able to house that sort of increase in population.
Interesting. And Let's talk about, I guess, geographically. What are some of the suburbs within Canberra ACT that are probably hot right now that people are looking at, or that might, you might see some upward trajectory in the future, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest infrastructure project that Canberra's ever undertaken is the light rail development. So we just recently had an election in Canberra last weekend. So the Labor government's going into their record 27th year in government. So it's been a very strong Labor government down there. The closest they came to losing in my sort of working adult career was 2 elections ago, when the light rail was the big talking point. And the people of Canberra sort of voted to get that up and running. And now stage 1 is now complete from Gungahlin, which is an outer suburb in the north, through to the city, and stage 2 is under construction now. So we've seen a lot of uplift in property prices that are in that light rail corridor from Gungahlin through to the city, and then now from the city out towards Woden. There's certainly pockets in a lot of other areas. Our owner and founder of Geocon, Nick Georgialis's model is to always build in those town centres that are close to jobs, employment, transport,
Makes sense.
your essential services.
Yep.
And we're seeing that the suburbs, not just for our apartments, but the suburbs that are close to those, all those things that I just mentioned, are the ones that are doing well, that have got that infrastructure, transport, jobs all around, that restaurant services. And so the model that he sort of set up 20 years ago is now saying that that's where the properties are doing the best, not just in the apartment space. So anything around those hubs are doing quite well.
I love it, and I've noticed there's like lifestyle in Canberra these days as well. Like you mentioned, some restaurants and trendy cafes. Like, where are some of the hotspots, mate? Where should we be going?
Oh well, yeah. I mean, off the back of the disposable income, 15, 20 years ago in Canberra on a Tuesday night, it would just be a ghost town. The tumbleweeds going down the road. But each week there's a new restaurants opening. There's a new one I'm actually going to tonight when I get back. The big restaurateur out of Melbourne. There's a new one out of Sydney that are coming down and trying to capitalise on these government workers that are on got great super and high wages and very very sort of bulletproof in their roles. I don't know anyone that's ever been fired from a government job. Yeah, well. So they can go out to dinner. I'm lucky to get out once a month, but there's a lot of good restaurants and bars that have opened up to capitalise on that income.
That's great, man. I'm going to ask a question that if I don't ask it, everyone's going to be asking in the comments. So there's a thing in the ACT called the leasehold system, right? Mm-hmm. Which is very different to any other market in Australia. Can you explain how that works in Canberra and the ACT, and how do you think that might affect the market in general? Yeah,
it's it comes up quite a bit actually, and when I started at Geocon coming up to 7 years ago now, I remember, I'd never worked in property before. I had a background working in sports administration for 15 years, and speaking to a few people and said, look, I'm going to go, I'm thinking about going to work for this property company, and my role is going to be to sort of, educate people outside of Canberra about Geocon and about the Canberra property market. And a lot of people that I respected and had successful careers in property said it'll never work. No one from outside of Canberra will buy property in Canberra because of the leasehold system. I said, oh, what do you mean? They said, oh, it's just, it just will never happen. And I'm glad I didn't listen to them because it's, it has worked quite successfly. But to answer your question, in Canberra we do have a leasehold system, so you don't own the land where your house is. You lease it off the government. It's up to a 99-year lease, so not the Crown lease system that's in the majority of Australia. So yeah, it's interesting. The banks treat it exactly the same. Being born and bred from Canberra, I sort of didn't really know there was any difference at all, and have bought and sold a few houses and not ever known how long was left on the lease. But there are some advantages to it. So basically how it works in the apartment space, when we register the lease at the point of completion, register the units plan, and the lease gets registered. It's a 99-year lease, and that's just how it is. And you can, whether you're in a house or an apartment, renew your lease if you want to. I think there's a small administration fee, $125 or $150 to do that. But again, the bank's treated exactly the same. There has never been leases that haven't been renewed. And I talk about, people say, oh, but they couldn't. Yeah, they could. But if for example, at my house that I live in with my family, if the government was to not allow me to renew my lease or didn't renew my lease, I think you would see no one would ever buy property in Canberra again.
Yeah, that's true.
I think you'd see a mass exodus from Canberra. The government of the time would never be elected again, and yeah, there'd be just anarchy. So whilst some people, once they get their head around it and do their own research, like what I did when people told me that people from Canberra or overseas outside of Canberra wouldn't buy there because of the system. Once you do your own research and do the reading, you can see that it's exactly the same as anything else. There are some positives to it though, because you're paying as an investor, if you're paying stamp duty for land that you're leasing and you don't own, you can claim that back in your tax.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's another benefit for investors. That doesn't apply to people that are living in the residence, but that's another benefit.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, correct. So it's another benefit for people. It's a tough one for the government, because whilst we have a land supply issue, and there's actually a lot of land there, privately owned farmland that's leasehold, the government can compulsorily acquire it. But if they were to do that for those reasons I outlined, that'd be anarchy. So they do start to have conversations with these large landowners of the privately held land to be able to acquire it for new suburbs and whatnot. But they've never forced anyone into it. I've seen them do in some areas near me, maybe buy 20% of it and put it in a new suburb and things like that. So they treat it the same. They have conversations with people, but it is a different system, but for all intents and purposes, exactly the same, with the added benefit of some tax benefits for investors.
Yeah, very interesting. You get that question all the time, I'm sure. And people might automatically see that and go, okay, they might mark Canberra off the list of their investment opportunities because of it. So it's interesting always to learn about it and do your own research, of course, is not financial advice.
Correct. Yeah, always do your own research. And I really encourage people to do that, because once they do read it and understand it a bit more, they'll sort of get the same confidence that I did.
I love it, man. Where's the ACT market heading?
Look, it's certainly the growth, particularly in the established home market, has slowed down since COVID. But I still see it heading in the same direction as the rest of Australia. I mean, it's I often look at what's happened over the last 100 years in property prices in Australia, and the general direction is north. Whilst there can be a few dips here and there, it doesn't, every 10 years it's better than the previous 10 years prior. And so whilst construction and labour costs have probably stabilised in the last few years, there's still that sort of steady growth. So, units in particular, I just think because of the gap in the median price between the established homes and the apartments, I think there's some going to be some larger growth numbers there. But across both houses and apartments, it's just going to keep tracking along, I believe.
Sounds like definitely a place to be looking at. So we'll keep our research going. I should mention, of course, Property Now brought to you by Coposit, and Coposit shares a wonderful relationship with Geocon, and we've had a couple of projects that offer Coposit down there as well, which is amazing. Wover is one that is just recently complete. We've had a number of Coposit customers move in, so amazing to see people be able to buy that way down in the ACT. You guys are really pioneers with us down in that region as well. And you mentioned your city project a couple of times, which is now also available with Coposit. So I want to give you a chance to have, this is the salesy bit of the podcast. So let's talk about Grande on London, which is a phenomenal spot. What excites me about it is one of the first projects in Canberra CBD in a long time. So, mate, tell us about the Grande and which is available on Coposit.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. We've had an excellent relationship with Coposit for many years now. So, yeah, I echo your sentiments there. It's been great to welcome the 700 odd people into Wover, including quite a few Coposit customers. So that's been excellent. In terms of our current project, the Grande, as you say, there's not too many opportunities to buy right in the centre of Canberra CBD. The last CBD project we did sort of 4 or 5 years ago now, Metropole. This location's sort of another level from that, because you have lake views from quite a few of the apartments in the Grande. Right in the heart of the city, under a kilometre from 2 world top 50 universities in ANU and University of New South Wales. That's opening up a new campus next year. So it's excellent. It's 330 odd apartments, a couple of commercial spaces, right on a light rail stop within walking distance to universities, jobs, restaurants, the Canberra centre. So there's no better location in Canberra, it's selling really well, and we're at a stage now that we're with 160 odd apartments to go, that we're doing another big push through anyone through Coposit that wants to get an apartment with probably a year and a bit to go till we settle.
Amazing. So if you want to get into the Canberra CBD with 10K, then you know where to look. Our listeners know and our viewers know where to look as well. Simon, always amazing to chat to you, mate. Thank you for dropping in while you're here in Sydney, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks very much.
The Property Now podcast offers opinions on Australian property news for informational and entertainment purposes only, and they are general in nature. It does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. It does not constitute professional advice. Always seek expert guidance before making any property-related decisions.